Do you ever want to make a video game, but end up staring at a blank screen? You watch YouTube videos about different game engines and different game design concepts, but your mind stays as blank as that screen. Instead, you should abandon our futuristic wonders and embrace the limits of the past. You should make retro video games.
Where are you going to start, though? How about you take things as literally as you can and make something for one of the classic consoles? I'm most familiar with the Game Boy, and I have some videos about getting started with it, but you can try out any console you want. They pretty much all have emulators, so you don't need real hardware. And they probably all have some homebrew community out there still making things for it. The best part of going down this route is that you can't escape the limitations. You're stuck with what the hardware can do. No cheating. You'll have to learn to make music with the SID chip, to race the beam for rendering. Or maybe you'll need to cram the visions in your head into 8x8 tiles with only 4 colors on the Game Boy. This sounds like it's going to make it harder to make a video game. And it is. The point of this is to restrict yourself, to limit your options and create new and interesting problems to solve. Modern game dev tools give an astounding number of options. You can create whatever you want, which sounds great. Of course, if you've ever spent your entire evening wandering around Blockbuster, trying to choose a movie with no idea what you want, you know that unlimited choice isn't always a blessing. The limits block off some of those choices, so you're not so overwhelmed, so you can actually get started. Making new and interesting problems for yourself can also help with creating. They'll hopefully get your creative juices flowing and inspire new ideas. And of course, solving more and varied problems gives you extra experience to help on the next problems to solve. They could also block you. That's where picking a console with an active community will be helpful. If you can't seem to figure something out in a reasonable amount of time, the community will give you somewhere to look for help. Whatever console you choose, you'll have to learn its ins and outs and all the tricks to get the most out of the hardware. And remember, this isn't old stuff just for the sake of nostalgia. You'll be learning the constraints that shape those old games, and the limits will help you flex your creativity.
Hmm? Oh, I neglected to mention, and hopefully this doesn't change anything between us, but I'm not actually a game developer, and I never have been. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, but hopefully something from this video will strike a chord with you and give you new ideas. The reason I'm making this video, even though I'm not a game developer, is for one thing, I do have a fair bit of experience as a generalist programmer, and I do have a fairly broad knowledge about retro consoles, and I'm hoping by sharing some of the stuff that I know, I'll help give you ideas in your own projects. Either way, I hope you get something useful out of this.
But maybe none of those old consoles speak to you, but you still want that real hardware experience. Well, then let me introduce you to the wonderful world of modern retro computers. People are still out there designing and building new 8-bit consoles and computers that are ready for you to start programming. Two that come to mind are the RC 2014 and the Game Tank. The RC 2014 is maybe more about retro computing than retro gaming, but it's a neat kit, and I really like the form factor. I have the rainbow one. Isn't it beautiful? The Game Tank is new to me, but it looks very interesting. It's firmly in the console realm with a bunch of games already made for it. If you choose this path, you might have to get your hands dirty with a soldering iron, but that'll just give you a deeper understanding of the system, and it'll give you an idea of where the system's limitations come from. One downside, though, is that your prospective audience is going to be much more limited than with a classic console. I'm sure the audience you do find will be very passionate, though. Just make sure you choose a platform with an active community around it, unless you want to figure everything out yourself. If you do want to figure everything out yourself, you could always design and build your own modern retro console. I mean, that's what the people behind those other modern ones did. If you're interested in what a project like that might be like, there's a YouTuber named James Sharman who has a series of videos where he designs and builds a computer from scratch. I'll link to it in the description. The benefits of this path is that you'll be the one setting all the limitations, or at least figuring out all the hardware trade-offs that'll lead to the limitations. The downside is that you're kind of getting away from game dev here and embarking on a project that verges on a lifestyle. And even if you finish the damn thing, you're going to have to build up a community around it so that you have someone to play your games. If the idea of all those chips and circuit boards gives you a headache, then follow me into cyberspace. And let me introduce you to the world of fantasy consoles. A fantasy console is an emulator for a video game console that never existed. That's the fantasy part. Since fantasy consoles aren't constrained by actual hardware, the limits they impose can be more aesthetic or vibes based. There's no better example of this than Pico 8. Pico 8 is really focused on creativity and community and leverages its significant limitations to support those goals. Pico 8 includes all the tools you need, all in the Pico 8 environment, including tools to write code, create sound effects and music, and sprites and maps. Pico 8 even lets you package your games into a virtual cartridge by encoding them into an image file, and not like a boring QR code or something. These images are made to look like an actual cartridge, with game labels and everything. Of course, to achieve that, the games need to be very small, just 32K big. Pico 8 has a lively community and gives you a great environment to play around without too much of a learning curve. So it's definitely a great place to start your journey into retro game dev. If you're interested in that retro aesthetic with a modern twist, but also like physical objects, you could look into developing for the Playdate, a modern handheld console that embraces the limits of retro consoles without sacrificing the benefits of modern technologies, and does all that with undeniable charm. And a crank! It is, however, not what I would call inexpensive, so it's going to be up to you to decide if it's worth the price of admission. I understand it has a fun, active community, though, and the console's limitations and quirks have led to some very creative games. But maybe you don't care about even the pretense of retro hardware. If you're the type to build your own game engine as the first step of any new game project, you could always make your own set of constraints. You can bake the limitation directly into it from the start. Make the graphics be tile-based. Limit the number of tiles. Constrain how much you can change graphics data. Limit your color palette. Limit the resolution. Or you could program a spiritual implementation of one of the classic consoles. I've made a partial implementation of a graphic system based on the Game Boys using JavaScript and HTML. I'm not trying to make it accurate, and it relaxes a lot of the limitations the original Game Boy had. But it still has enough limitations that it could be fun to make a game with it one day. The point here is to design something that will hopefully be fun for you to develop in. And if you're making video games, hopefully you have some idea of making something fun. The final path you can take is up here, because the limits are all in your mind, but not like in a way where you should try to overcome them. What I mean is that you use all the modern tools and engines and whatever you want, but you create a set of rules that you have to follow. Maybe the limits are just stylistic, like limiting yourself to retro style graphics or a restrictive color palette. Maybe you limit yourself to a minimal set of inputs or just give yourself a really low maximum file size for the game. The limits don't even need to be retro inspired. The point here is to make weird problems for yourself so that your creativity can kick in to solve them, and to restrict the space of possibilities so you're not frozen by decisions or wandering off on far flung creative tangents instead of making progress on your main project.
No, this is important.
Of course, the downside to this option is that the only thing keeping you honest to the limits is yourself. You might get tempted to stray from the retro path. That might be a positive, though. You can use the limits to help get the ideas going. And then, when you have a firm base for what you're making, you can loosen them so that the limits don't get in the way of actually making something. Or maybe you'll discover that whatever you're making doesn't fit a retro vibe at all, and you pivot to something else.
To wrap things up, creating limits for yourself can be a handy way to get out of a creative block, or to push yourself into interesting new ideas. Retro game dev happens to be a conveniently packaged set of limits and constraints ready to go. You have a number of options too. Developing for one of the classic consoles gives you a well-traveled path with limits you can't escape. There are also modern retro consoles that could be fun, but their communities are probably going to be a lot less developed, but I'm sure they'll be very passionate. Having an active and welcoming community will help reduce some of the friction of developing for these limited consoles. If you're into hardware design, you could always try to build your own retro console, though that will take you away from game dev for a while, and it'll be difficult to build up an audience. Fantasy consoles like Pico 8 give you a retro experience without having to be bothered with actual real hardware. The Playdate is a modern console with some of the retro spirit, and it has a very active and lively community. If you plan on building an engine or a framework for your game, You can bake the limits directly into it from the start. And finally, you can keep the constraints in your head by creating a set of rules and limits that will restrict you as you develop. And if you're not stubborn, this lets you abandon the limits if they're no longer serving your creativity or actually getting in the way of you finishing something.
Whichever path you choose, or even if you don't choose any of them and do something completely different, I hope that I was able to give you some ideas to help you with your creative efforts. I know I'm not the first person to preach the benefits of limits and constraints for the creative process. There are a lot of YouTube videos about the idea, if you need more inspiration. Another place to look for limitations are game jams, which constrain you simply by limiting the time you have to create. But many have themes that layer on even more limits to spur your creativity. If you've enjoyed being told what to do by someone who only tangentially knows what he's talking about, remember to like the video and maybe subscribe. If you want to help me make more videos, you can support me on Ko-fi or Patreon. Links in the description. I hope I've helped you, even just a little, to have your imagination filled with inspiration and to find only the most satisfying walls to bang your head against. Bye.